Let me know when you're ready. Oh, it looks like we're recording. Okay. So, yes, I'm Warren Walters. Nice to meet everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about combining the powers of clicks and code and a term domino, which we'll be learning about in a minute. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm Warren Walters. I am a Salesforce engineer at Blackthorn IO. Not many people know that. I recently switched jobs. I also have a blog, salesforcementor.com, and those are some handles and my YouTube channel where you can catch me. From there, let's talk about the agenda. So what is Domino, why you should care about it, some of the things that some of my favorite ways of manipulating clicks and code, so how they work together, and some best practices for writing configurable code. So I will kind of stop here and say, feel free to speak up, ask questions as we're going along. I do have like a set path that we'll be going through, but I want to leave it open and flexible so that we can talk about, we can go down different rabbit holes if we need to. So yeah, definitely speak up from there. But that's the agenda. Let's jump straight into it. So what is Domino? I'm going to say this a few times, a bunch of times. And Domino is something that I completely made up. I was looking for a term to, encompass all of the ideas that are going to be coming out of this presentation. And I just landed on Domino. So it means absolutely nothing, but all words mean absolutely nothing if you think about it. So Domino is the thought process of making your code more configurable. If you are a developer and you're used to writing code and maybe you don't think about really writing configurable code, you're just writing your code to have like this specific purpose. And this does, one thing, and you create it, you set it, and it's gone. And then lo and behold, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month later, a business user or some sort of new requirement comes in and the code needs to change again and you need to go in. So the idea behind Domino is to kind of predict some of those changes that need to happen and make your code configurable so that those changes, you don't have to go back in the code, make your updates, do your test classes, and all of those things to kind of get back in through the longer development cycle. So the other part of Domino is about empowering admins and end users to have, I'll say, some control over the code, right? There's this whole big thing where there's a huge disconnect between like how code works and understanding between potentially admins and end users and how the code actually works and what developers do. So what we want to do is kind of bridge the gap in terms of having some control in configurations, either buttons, you have it, and I'll name some of them, to be able to work with the code a little bit. I'll say a little, give some toggles, some controls for it. And then the other thing about Domino is just making sure that your code is flexible so that you can make changes or make updates to certain ranges, certain values, and your code will reflect it successfully or scalably without you having to go all the way back into it, like I mentioned before, and make huge changes. So that's the idea behind all of this, and I'm encapsulating it in the word Domino as I do. So why do we even want to do this? Why do we want to make our code configurable? Well, we want to do this for a bunch of different reasons, but some of the main ones on here is really making your code scalable. As you start to write code, as you start to build out business processes, and your org starts to mature, it's going to get more and more complex. You'll have to deal with more records, you'll have to deal with integrations, you'll have to deal with lots of data volume. So what you want to do is try to build your code in a way that it can scale appropriately across many different fronts. So the Salesforce platform really allows you to do this in many different ways, but it definitely allows you to deal with, one piece of it is large data volume. So dealing with things that are coming in at a rapid pace, and a lot of that processing is happening in the cloud. Another reason for this is dealing with the hard stuff. So developers or their job is generally not the easy things to get done. So making your code configurable kind of shifts some of the responsibility of some of the hard stuff onto other people. So maybe they're some of the aspects that you had in your code, you wanted to have it in you shifted over to an administrative type of piece where instead of needing to go into the code, somebody can flip a switch inside of Salesforce and they can turn off the code or turn off some trigger that was running. And you like these two go hand in hand. Your dev time is precious, right? Every moment that you're not thinking about, debugging an issue, and you're spending it kind of like, doing, let's say, smaller items, that could potentially take away from you finishing out some more difficult or elaborate new integration, new UI, new UX, all of those types of things that just can't be done as of right now through configuration or declarative means. So you want to make your code configurable because it will help your organization scale. It will help you with your time so that you're focusing on harder things. So scaling your code, this is a little bit, it's a broad conversation, and it really starts with design. So for me as a seasoned developer, I never just jump in and start coding anything. I will take time to think about it, talk with different people in different departments, talk with other developers, talk with architects on how to design my code properly. If you aren't on a team like that, you can still talk it out with, I guess, the whoever's asking for the requirements. Go on things like the Discords and the Salesforce Ohana Slack, but just try to find ways to really think about your problems and ask the underlying questions of, hey, you asked for X, but the underlying issue is actually Y. Let's roll it back and figure out what it is. So for scaling your code, you want to make sure that you're thinking about how to, one, is it actually a problem, but two, the design behind it. So once you start figuring out what you want to do, it then turns into, okay, I'm going to build this solution. How do I make sure that this solution is going to last for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years kind of thing? And how do I make sure that it's flexible enough so that if either I do need to make a change or there's a small change in like date range requirements, things like that, that it's not going to be a pain to go back into the code and update the entire process. So that flexibility that we talk with scaling really makes sure that you're spending the time up front so that later on you don't have to go and refactor and rip out potentially all of the code that's in there. A big part of this is componentizing your code or whatever you're building. So there's a big push for Lightning Web components, and the reason you have this component so that they're small, modularized, and you can change them a bit easier than building this giant million-line monolithic page that somebody's going to have to try to read through. When things are componentized, they're easier to digest, easier to fix that one specific piece, and you're generally not going to go into a 1,000-line thing and try to figure out where it is. Especially if you need one change, you'll go to that one component, make that update, and then move on. So dealing with the hard stuff that devs have to deal with, right? A lot of these are things with integrations. As of right now, there are some ways for admins and non-programmers in Salesforce to deal with integrations, but generally those cost money. So integrations, a large portion of it is still on the development side of things. And I don't know about you all, but there aren't too many companies that are running their entire business on Salesforce, at least the ones that I've worked at. So there's going to be a big push for integration or communication across the board, because you want to make sure that everybody's not in disparate system. There's data syncs and stuff like that, that all your data is together and unified. So when we talk about dealing with the hard stuff, devs really, this is one of the big areas for them. They write a lot of integrations, and this is something that configuration hasn't fully solved yet. And these are things that you when you're working with Domino and making your code more flexible and configurable, you're able to focus on these, integrations. Same thing with mass record updates. Working with hundreds, thousands of records is fine, but as soon as you approach like millions and hard computational things, a lot of that is going to happen inside of code because it just works more efficiently there, or you even need to like offload it to another system. User experience and user design is something that Salesforce does pretty well, but there are some limitations with the configuration aspects of it. And if your customers or your org is looking for a very specific type of design, then you'll have to move to Lightning Web Components or components, stuff like that, to really make it be as the way that they want it to be. And then making things simple, right? We talked about it a little bit earlier. It's easy to overcomplicate something. It's harder to just make it simple and make it work. And that a lot of times as a developer's job is to take down potentially complex problems and then morph them into something that's actually simple, like one button click or a single path to get through to somewhere. So developers' times are precious. We potentially deal with a lot of things, and we want to avoid making small code changes because there is potentially a long development cycle and delivery cycle that goes along with things. So if you're like me, you want to make sure that you're developing in a sandbox, your own sandbox, making all your code changes, deploying that to a UAT or some sort of test sandbox, and then having people come in and test your change, and then having that deploy to production. So if it's a really small change, so let's take maybe some date range has changed from 6 months to 3 months, and you need it to go into code to change that. It seems like a very small change, but ideally you should go through that entire testing process before deploying it to production, just to make sure that nothing else breaks since you're actually changing code. So these small changes can help eat up time from doing things like integrations, UI, building components, stuff like that. Doing big refactors when it comes to changing of requirements. These will once again take you away from those things. And then the other thing that kind of is near to my heart, which is you may not always be there as a developer. So maybe you're out on vacation, maybe you won the lottery and you're no longer at the company. So you need to make sure that your code can, let's say in the absence of a developer at a company, your code can be potentially configured by an admin so that it can, everything doesn't come to a complete halt. Now, I'm saying a lot of like configuration by an admin and things like that, and I think on the next slide, we're going to take a look at what that actually like translates into, but it's not like an admin going into, write code or anything like that. It's more along the lines of giving them functionality and configuration to control the code that you're dealing with. So I want to just make that clear for anybody that's like heart stopping. Oh, we're going to have admins writing code. Well, that's another topic for another time. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty gritty on like what all of this stuff actually is. We're developers. I want to see some code, that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of different types of dominoes. I'm going to be demoing some of my favorite ones, but there's tons and tons of different types of things that you can think of that are out there. But ideally, it's whenever you make your code configurable for somebody to edit it or change it, that's not a developer, you don't have to go through code, then it counts for me in what is Domino. So some of my favorite ones are manual skips. So these are just fields on a record where you can say, I don't want this to apply, so we're going to skip over it. We've got things like formula fields. So those are obviously configurable inside of your org. You can change some values around and then make it work. Or change ranges, change values, and those selections will be different. Custom metadata types, which work kind of like records. If you haven't seen them, we'll go through those. And invocable methods, which are probably my all-time favorite, which allow you to use code inside of flows. So for those admins that can write more flows, but they need some additional power behind it, you can potentially create code and have it be accessible inside of your flows. So I've got a long laundry list on the right side, though, of other things: custom labels, custom settings, URL parameters, named credentials. All of these things are, you're able to access them inside of configuration, and you can also access from the configuration. You can pull them into your code and listen, change, do anything about really access and take action upon the different values that exist in there. Okay, so let's start out with manual skips. This, for me, is one of the most basic ones. Manual skips, in my mind, are usually on a record, and they basically say, if you're working on doing work on a particular record, or let's say a trigger has activated, if the value is true, or your manuals, you've reached that value, I'll just keep it with a checkbox for now, but if your checkbox is true, then you want to skip over that record. You don't want to do anything on that particular record. So for your organizations, this may be different. You may have different reasons for this, but ideally, for one example for me is I've had customers that they have a long list of accounts, and there's some automated process to pull in data for it. But for a few specific accounts, they don't want to pull in the revenue data that's coming in. So you create a manual script, you check it on only those specific accounts, and then you're going to skip over it. So I'm going to switch over to a live demo. Couple things are going to come from this, or a couple questions that may come from this, is like where I'm getting all this code. There is a Salesforce made repository called Apex Recipes. It is, I'll talk a little bit more about it on the end, but it's like a repository of code snippets and just ways of writing specific aspects of code. That would be how Salesforce developers do it. So it's made by Salesforce developers, and they really helped me out when I was learning in terms of like figuring out, hey, if I wanted to write an integration, here's a template of one. So yeah, we'll dive into it a little bit more, but I use this repository a bit, and there's a app for it as well that you can install. So a couple things here. I'm going to go to an account, and we're going to see that there is a validation rule if inside of code, if I enter a shipping state greater than, if the length is greater than 2. So ideally they want like the 2-letter state code, but let's say somebody comes in and types out Florida for Florida. Oh, spelled it wrong, but that's okay. Let's say that somebody types out the wrong length inside of here. So we can come in here, type FL. There's another trigger that's running that's going to turn it to Indiana, but we won't talk about that. So just to repeat that again, if we come in here, try to do more than the actual length, it's going to give us an error. Now, this is not a validation rule error. This is actually inside of code. This is I'll zoom in a bit. This is the code repository for that piece. So there's a bunch of stuff that you can go through, but today we're going to be looking at the trigger stuff and a few other items for it. So in here, somewhere in here, over here, we have this validation, right? So if the state is not blank and the length is greater than 2, we want to throw this error, which makes sense for, when we were creating it, when you got those business requirements. Sure, that all sounds good. But what happens if we actually do want to have a record that can beat this validation that we have in here? So this is where like domino aspect comes into play, and we talk about things where we can, allow users, admins to be able to affect some of the code. So in this instance, what I did was created a checkbox that said, skip the shipping validation. So it's this checkbox over here. And if it's checked, we're going to be allowed to put in whatever we want. Well, it's saved and then it overrode again. So I should probably take a look at that. But we saw that it didn't give an error. So if we take this out and just type in whatever we want in here, we're still going to get our error. But if we check our skip the shipping validation and hit save, it's at least going to allow us to save and then override again. So in here, all we really did was you needed to have a checkbox on the record itself. But as we're looping through our accounts that come through here, we're going to, if our checkbox is true, and just for those who potentially are new to development and are trying to learn, as long as our checkbox is true, it's going to skip over or continue in our next iteration of the loop. So we are allowing somebody who has, potentially not been in our code, not seen our code, but either has documentation or has been educated on what this checkbox does, to be able to come in and skip over values that are potentially going to be affected by this particular item. We have a question in there, the question is it only an admin or that can change it, or can end users change it? That is really up to you and whoever you've helped design these requirements for. So if it doesn't make sense for an end user or a salesperson to have access to this checkbox, but maybe a power user or a data entry person who is setting up all of these different accounts and they know the data a little bit more intimately, then maybe they'll have access to this checkbox. And in that sense, you would just make them, that's field level permissions, right? You would only give people that need the specific access to this specific checkbox. You would only give them access to it. But ideally, that's something for the business or the admins to kind of figure out. You, on the developer side of things, you either predicted that this would have been a need, or you worked with like an admin or your architect to know that this is going to be something needed at a point in time. But awesome questions. So question in here also, basically, why didn't we use a validation rule? That is a great question. I would have probably have used the validation rule, but this came with the repository. So I just kind of wanted to use it as an example. But ideally, this could have been done in a validation rule. Some of it could have been done in a validation rule. There's some other pieces where it's like adding values to it, and that would take more things. But ideally, and the process with this too, you can also use in a validation rule, right? You can say, okay, in your validation rule, if this checkbox is true, then you don't want it to go off. Otherwise, if it's false and it meets the criteria, then you want it to go off. So very similar things in there as well. But awesome questions. Yep. We got Pat in there as well. So this is one idea. And yeah, with a lot of the things I talk about, these are more ideas for either you as an admin to talk about with your development team or people that you're working on stuff with, or you can, if you're a developer, you can take these ideas and make them more specific to your role or what you're actually doing. Okay, so we talked about manual skips, which are great. The other thing that I want to bring up is filter formulas, or formulas that you use in your code that can be manipulated or used to change values inside of your code, or change. Ideally, it's change ranges for me, but they can be used for anything. So I guess I can ask a question, or I don't know if it's like raise hands or put thumbs up in the chat, but how many of us know about the is closed and is won fields on opportunity, like what they do if they're out there, like how they kind of work? So Sagal is saying yes. We've got a few other people that are saying yes. So these are great examples of, yeah, we got a few people saying yes. These are great examples of fields that are, one, background fields, but they change depending on different values on the opportunity. So the is closed is based off of the opportunity status, and depending on how the opportunity status is set. So if it's in a closed state, then it's always going to be, then this value is going to be true. But your closed state can change on an opportunity because you can add multiple opportunity statuses and you set whether the opportunity status is closed or not. Similar thing with is one. If your opportunity, your one status could be anything. It could be X, it could be I did it, great job, it could be complete. But as long as it's in the closed status, did I miss the where clause? You were right. I did miss the where clause. If it is in the closed status, then, or the one status, then that checkbox is going to be true. So you'll have to, this is a great example of something that is technically configurable in code. It's works similar to a formula field, but it's a field that you can kind of change in configuration, and it helps dictate what's happening inside of your code if you have a select statement like this. So we're also going to take a look at this one. And to do this one, we're going to take a look at queuable methods. So another question out there. Do I want to save? Nah. How many of us know about queuable methods and what queuable methods are? And if you haven't, queuable methods, they work, I'll say, similarly to future methods, but you can chain them together. I'll sum it up. Once again, this is not a talk on queuable methods. I don't know if I could talk at length at them, but they could be their own session in its own. But you can treat them like future methods or an asynchronous process that can happen, and you can chain them together. So I wanted to, one, demonstrate a queuable method, and then two, just so that people can get a little bit familiar with it, but then also see how, some of the domino stuff comes into play. So for this domino, what I've done is I just created a field inside on the account object that is annual revenue category. So what the heck is annual revenue category, and why do we care if it's high? So there's this field, annual revenue category, and let's take a look at it, what it actually is. It is a formula field, a formula text field, and depending on the annual revenue, it's going to output high, mid, low, or get out of here. So depending on the values, it gives us this range, and it's going to then spit out what type of category it's in. You can think of this like anything, right? Inside of your org, these can be tiers, these can be like gold, platinum, whatever types of, I'll say, categorization you have for your customers based on annual revenue. But the main points about this, though, is that this field is in configuration. It's a formula field. And if we needed to change it, we don't have to go back into the code and update our different categories that existed. All we need to do is come into our formula field and update that value. Now, I as a developer, I wouldn't need to go through like the code deployment process or anything like that. If you're an admin or if you're updating this, you should still do it in the sandbox and run all of your tests and stuff like that. But it won't take as long to get from the idea is created and somebody needs to update it to, hey, this is deployed into our production and our users are actually using it. So we can see here that we have this range is high. If we go to our accounts list, do I have it on my accounts list? I do not have it on my accounts list. Let's add it really quickly. Let's take this off, and annual revenue range. Let's bring this up. So we can see that our annual revenue category, there's a bunch of different ones out here. We've got some mids, get out of here, high. So depending on the annual revenue range, it has been updated. And if we needed to change this, it's super easy, right? We're coming in here, updating this value. So anything now over, was that $9 million will get high. Sucks to be lower than $9 million. And we'll give this a second. So we've got these guys in high. Let's see if we can find an 8 million. That is now in mid. So this is the mid tier now. And when we look back in our code, we didn't have to change anything for this query selection, right? It's only using this specific field, and we're using the high value on that specific field. So if I was out for the weekend or for the week and executives came in and they said, oh, we got to change the range from 8 million to 9 million. We got to deploy this code. Well, I'm on vacation, so I won't be going into the code to make any changes, but ideally we had the forethought to build it into a formula field and make that change in there. So now I'm going to run this just so that we can kind of see some of the changes come through. I think let's create a new text file. And if you guys haven't seen some of this stuff, so for, I'll go a little bit on Cubable really quickly. What this is going to do, it's going to run asynchronously. It's going to update our account description for any accounts that are in the high category. And then it's actually going to call another queuable method, which is this queuable recipe, which I think does almost the same exact thing. Yeah, updates the description as well. So once again, this is just test code just to give people an idea of like how queuable methods work and all of that. This one's selecting all of the accounts, but with a limit of 1,000, and then updating the description as well. So what I'm going to do really quickly before I run it is I'm going to get a high account and one that's not going to get selected. And I'm just going to clear out the description because I know I ran this a few times last night preparing for this. Going to take out these here. Save. And then I'm going to, oh, I don't have a calculator open. I'm going to run my queuable method. So to run a queuable method, ideally these can be set through like normal processes. I'm just going to run these in Apex Anonymous. Some other just quick tidbits. Bitno, you can open up a new file. You can run these a couple different ways, like selecting it, doing Control-Shift-P, and doing like execute Apex Anonymous selected, things like that. I generally like to open up a new file, just a blank file, do Control-Shift-P, execute Apex Anonymous in the editor window. And this is going to be the same exact way that you, like if you're in the developer console and you went to Apex Anonymous. So this has run. Since it's an asynchronous process, we're going to give it a little extra time to finish processing, right? Async processes, they don't run immediately like triggers or anything like that. They wait for your resources to free up on the system, and then they finally run. So that might be enough time. Let's refresh this record and see if we have some new values. So we've got for our high, we have it updated. We did get a null in here, but it's saying that it's edited by the first chained queuable. And then let's refresh this one. And we're still waiting. This might not have been selected by the first 1,000 records, but I think Pat was mentioning, yeah, you're guaranteed for it to happen sometime in the future. It will happen eventually at some point, but it will happen. But at least for the chaining of the methods, we can see that our first one did hit, and this one did not at least get the description updated for the first criteria of our queuable in here. You know, because this is selecting everything that's in the high tier. And if we needed to change it again, we would just come into our field and admin. Anybody can come in. Well, not anybody, but hopefully you know what it is. But the accessibility piece of just coming in and editing the formula field to be the new value that we need is a lot greater than having this written strictly in code and then needing somebody to go into the code, figure out where this is, and make the updates, change the test classes, make the, do the deployment, do the UAT, push it to production, do some additional testing, all that stuff. And you can write your test classes in a similar way so that, they're making sure that it passes based on the different requirements that are there. But that's, once again, another topic. Okay, so questions so far. I'm jumping into some other stuff, some other dominoes, some more complex stuff. But please, if you all have any questions, ask in the chat. Feel free to interrupt me. We'll go from there. Okay, custom metadata types. Now we're getting into some more, I'll say complex stuff. I'll potentially say more interesting things to me personally. Oh, we got a question. Can the admin update the low and the medium? Yeah, this is just a field inside on the account record. So whoever has access to this, as long as they have the, as long as they know what they're doing, and maybe you built a documentation around this so that later on when a new requirement comes in and it's like, hey, we need to update our medium value to be a little bit more inclusive. So let's bump it down to, this is like 500K or something like that. You're able to go back in and update that. All you need is, I guess, admin access to the record, and you're able to change that value. This I talk about a little bit later, but it opens the door to some situations in your code where you want to make sure that it's a little bit more bulletproof, but with some forethought, with some design, it really helps to make your code more flexible so that you can continue as a developer. You're working on the hard stuff, right? And admins, business users have a little bit more control or flexibility in what's happening in the code, at least for the filters. But great question. Okay, so custom metadata types are one of my favorites. To sum it up, like if you've never used them before, they kind of work as an object inside of Salesforce, but they're more like let's say a setting object or a background object that are only accessible to admins or people that have, I guess it's an admin profile or those types of credentials on the back end. And it's only accessible through the setup, and you're able to set up specific objects for kind of any use. They're accessible in many different places like flows and code, but they work more on I'll say a one-off basis. So they're not like normal records, and we'll see what that means in a second once I get into the demo. But custom metadata types are used in many different cases. I love using them as field mappings for integrations as they come through, and I've done an example on that. You can use them to turn off and on processes. So let's say you have a trigger process set up and everything is linked together, but you're doing a huge data load and you want to turn off the trigger. Well, if you have set your code up properly, you can come into custom metadata and say, okay, let's turn off the trigger while we're doing this data load, and then we'll turn it back on. Please remember to turn it back on. We'll turn it back on after the data load is finished. Storing certain types of credentials, it's not always recommended to store them in custom metadata types, but there are certain situations when you want to do it. Storing calculation data. So let's say that you have like a discount code that you're referencing in a few different places. Well, instead of like hard coding that in code, you can put it inside of a custom metadata type. And if that value ever changes, you can go in and change the value in configuration versus changing it inside of code. For some of the things with it, it's accessible in code, it's updatable, it's also accessible in flows. You can deploy it and it'll keep the data, and the data exists inside of test classes as well, which make it a lot easier to test with than things like custom settings, which is very similar, but a bit different. So I created a quick field mapping example for custom metadata types. I've used this a few times for client orgs. So let's say we're writing an integration. We need to map fields from the integration. Let's say that they have a work order object. We need to map those fields from the work order. So maybe there's like the name, the date, the amount of a work order, who's doing it. All of that needs to map to maybe a custom object in Salesforce. So instead of in the code, hard coding all of those values and making it very static, so it's a bit hard to change, you can build custom metadata type that maps the fields one-to-one, or maps the fields dynamically, so that you can then go into the custom metadata type and tell the integration what fields to use. So lots of words. I think the demo will help go over it a little bit more. Okay, custom metadata types. If you've never seen these before, like I mentioned, one of my favorites. Definitely do, look them up and dive into them a bit more. But to get to them, they're in the setup. They are accessible for administrators and anybody with an admin profile. And there's a few different layers to them. You can create a brand new custom metadata type, and it works similar to like creating a brand new object. And then for your custom metadata type, here's the one that, here's the one that I created. You have certain fields that you can create. So what I did was what I did for the field mapping is that there is a field name for the one object, and then there's a field name for the other object. So we're talking about forms and leads. And if we create a record, those two values are going to match up when it comes to the integration. So let's look at what that looks like when you create a record under a custom metadata type. It looks similar to this. So what I'm doing here is I'm naming the record, which is form agency to company. So there's an agency field, and we're mapping it to the lead field of the company. So on the form, there's agency, and we're mapping it to the lead company. Similar thing, there's an applicant name, and we're mapping it to the last name on the lead. For some more context, let's go to the job applicant record. Looks like I got one here. And it's got these fields on here already. So there's the applicant first name, agency, and last name. And what I want to do is when I run some code, it converts these values into the lead. It automatically pushes those values into a lead, right? It takes, at least from the mapping, it takes the agency and the last name, and it brings them over. So what does this look like in code? Let's open up the, what is it called? I would think it'd be this. So a little bit of code here. What we're doing is we are taking in a list of job applicants here, creating a list of leads that we're eventually going to insert. We are querying our custom metadata type. So we are we're doing a selection of our custom metadata type. So all of the records that exist here, these records in here, we're grabbing them in our SQL query. Then we're going to loop over our applicants because we could have multiple applicants that have came through. This is a list. And then depending, now that we have our now that we're in like maybe one individual applicant, we're going to get our field mapping. So there's a lead field, and then there is the job, the applicant field. So the first one, let's say that it's agency. We're going to have agency inside of here, and then we're going to have the corresponding field that we're going to map to the lead. So that's going to be company. So then we're going to put those inside of our lead record. So I guess if you didn't know, or this is one thing I may have learned a little bit more recently is that you can use API names to set values on a lead. So instead of doing something like temp lead.company, I think it's like this, equals, well, actually it would just equal whatever this value is, but let's say job app dot agency, something like this. So instead of hard coding this in here like this, that's happening inside of this process, and it's basically turning it into a process like this. It's saying this value is going to be company. That's most likely a string. And this value is, it's taking it from the agency and whatever value is inside of our agency. So let's just say that it's test. So this line 22 is translating to line 21 once it actually executes, right? We're grabbing those values using the key value pairs on the lead record. Something kind of cool. And the biggest part about this is that we're not hard coding any of this. You know, there's no contact, or there's no company, there's no hard coding the data in here. Or I guess it would be job app agency. Right? We're not hard coding any of this value, any of these values. We are dynamically setting them based on the string values that are coming through from our custom metadata type. So the power lies in the dynamicness of putting a value inside of here. Okay, lots of words. Let's see it. And then, sorry, after all of this, it inserts the records and it returns leads. So let's see this in, or I'll pause there. Does anybody have any questions before I actually go through it? Because this probably took me a little while to nail down and figure out before I like fully grasped it. And while we stop there, I'm going to prep some code over here. All right, don't see any questions coming through. So what I'm going to do now is line 20, it looks like a get method and another method together. Yes, line 20 is two, I guess, methods. It's not really method chaining, but it is a get method. So it's basically like calling job app dot agency. So when this field job app field name, when it comes through, it's going to be some sort of, it's going to be some sort of value that we get here. And that's going to be the API name of whatever the value is that comes through with the record. So instead of calling this specifically to get the value, we can just call our string name very similar to this. We can just call our string name, and this is going to get the value for us. You know, that these two, line 20 and the highlighted section of 21, equal out to be just about the same thing, except the way that we're calling it in here, it's just passing variable references through. But great question. So I'm going to, let's create a new one because I've butchered that one a bunch. Pat, the agency is Salesforce, and let me see if I spell your last name right. There we go. Okay, so we have this record, and if we run our code, what we're expecting to happen is it runs through, grabs our metadata, fills out the records, and then it inserts a new lead. So let's see if that happens. Let me just paste this ID in here, execute, whoops, execute what's in our editor. We can look through here. We don't see any issues popping up. I don't think so. So that all looks good. I think there was supposed to be a print statement. I don't remember. But the easiest way to check is to look to see if a lead got created. on today's leads. There we go. We've got Pat. It transferred over his company and his name, but we noticed that it did not bring his first name over. So this goes back to a bit of the domino aspect of things. If we wanted to add his first name in, what would we need to do? We wouldn't have to go to the code and update anything, because this is all dynamic. It's being pulled from the custom metadata types. So what we would need to do is go into our custom metadata type. We see that there's a value in here. We would need to add a new record in. Let me grab this real quick. So all we would need to do is add a new record in, and so app first name to lead first name. That sounds about right. And then the form API field name, if we look at the application, the API name is going to be applicant first name _ C. So we're just going to change this to first name. Let me capitalize it. And the lead field API name. So we're going to type in first name here. So now what we have done, we've added another record in, and that record will, let me go back to our records. That record will now map. When we run our code, it's now going to pull 3 records in here. And the third one is going to be for our first name. We're going to map those values in. So let's run this again on the same record and see if a new value gets created. That ran. Let's check out I should probably add these to the top bar here. So we can now see there's a new lead that got created with Pat's information, or his first name now, his first name, last name, and the company as Salesforce. So we didn't have to do any code changes. We've literally mapped our values through, and it didn't require us to go through any large processes. It should go through some sort of process to get checked and validated and all of that stuff, but it's not the same as if we needed to write some brand new code or update our code and do our test classes and all that stuff. None of this stuff, or I won't say none of it, but a lot of this stuff is not hard coded. We saw that we added the first name value in there. We can add an infinite amount of values as long as the records are created. But we're able to do that field mapping without doing much extra. Now, some disclaimers, this is not finished code. You'll need to do a lot more error checking and handling and design around this kind of stuff. But if you build it in such a way, you're able to make these changes fairly quickly and continue to work on other things, more interesting things in my perspective as a developer, than needing to go in here and make tiny changes and stuff like that. Questions so far? I've got one more major thing to go over, and I gotta make sure my time's running out, so I'll go through it quick. But questions, please let me know. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is invocable methods, one of my absolute favorite ways of doing things of Domino. And ideally, they're just exposing code inside of flows. So these are, there's many different use cases. A lot of the ones that I use is maybe you want to, as of right now, certain things in flows aren't really accessible. So I think they just added record filtering, doing in-sockle searches and stuff like that, or filtering based on IDs. A few things weren't really possible. They're making a lot of more changes in flows to make it better. So what I like to do is to expose custom or invocable methods. And these are basically code that you can expose inside of flows so that they can be called. So that they can be called inside of flows, and anybody can kind of work with them. So they get the power of Apex, but you can do some of it inside of flows. Okay, so to do this, what better way than to make an action? Because nobody's going to run this applicant handler and this code over here, come into the Apex Anonymous. So I converted this into an invocable method. Very simple. I won't say straightforward, but very simple. All it does is there's an invocable method. You send in a list of applications or the job applicants, and it calls our applicant handler that we just saw that does the custom metadata type handling in here. So all it does is call this, jumps to this code, and it runs and it creates our lead. So if we're on a applicant, I created a flow that is based off of this button. And what this does is it checks our information. You're getting some Z's because that's all I can think of right now, but you get a chance to update your information. And then when you call it, it creates a lead from it. So we've updated this info. And if we jump back onto our leads for today, we have another one that gets created. So let's take a quick peek at the flow to like wrap all this up. It is this screen flow create lead. And what this is here's the first screen where we're just filling in our initial information. There's an update, and then there's this action. This is the bread and butter of it. This action is the code that we have created. So you pass in your record, and then that record gets shoved into here. You can do any processing. You can do whatever you want after it's inside of code. And then for us, we're just doing that lead creation process. So we're calling this initial code, and then our lead gets created, and that's it, right? You can invocable methods are super fun because it is inside of flows. Flows are getting even more powerful, but there are things that it can't do, right? So you're then enabling your end users, your admins to be able to work with your code a little bit better. You can put parameters around it, but it's still giving them flexibility to access more complex features instead of being, this could have been a trigger, right? This could have been on anything, but you're giving them the opportunity to design their administrative or configuration process in with bits of code to do some more of the complex features. Yeah, I could talk at length for invocable methods. Super cool, super fun stuff in there. And then just kind of wrap things up even more, we've got just best practices. You really need to think about this stuff before you're implementing them. Like everything I showed today were very simple, very straightforward. But as you're building these out, it gives potentially a lot of power to people that may not know what's happening behind the scenes. So let's say we change that range of high, medium, low for the annual revenue categories to 0 for everything. That could break a lot of stuff. That could send mass emails out. So you want to build in safeguards for a lot of this stuff. Make sure there's documentation around it. Talk to the different people on your team to make sure that they understand what a lot of it is doing. But ideally, this was just to give you all an idea of things that are out there. And as you're designing code, as you're talking with developers, as you're building things out for your org, it gives you some ideas of things to build into what you're doing. I think that's it. Some resources and things to look at. So, that's me, Warren Walters. You can email me there. Check out Salesforce Mentor, my blog. And oh yeah, that is a good thing. Field sets. I do love field sets too. I've been using them. So Pat mentioned field sets, another great one that's on there. The code snippets that I used, I built on top of a few of them, but check out Apex recipes and LWC recipes. Follow the Apex commandments. Check out those books. All dark mode, everything. That's all I got. I think I'm right at time.
Thank you very much, Walter. Does anybody have any questions either for Walter about what he talked about or in general for myself or Walter? We'll hang around and answer some questions.
Can you share that in your Slack channel?
I totally can. Lots of, could probably copy these resources and paste them in. Give me 1 second. Or I'll toss them the pat. I think you can. I don't know if you can blast email out some of these things.
Yeah, so once I get the slide deck from Walter as a PDF, I'll attach it to the recording for this session, and they'll all be available as part of that for this.
Cool. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions, comments? You know, we're ran out of time. Everybody's back to work.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Enjoyed having you. Everybody have a lovely weekend, and we'll see everybody around later.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.